Hello, everyone. My name is Muhammad Ali Ijaz, and my presentation is on frames from Afghanistan, American and Pakistani media coverage of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021. Right. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the dramatic Taliban recapture of Kabul on August 16th, 2021, was followed very closely by the American and Pakistani media. Uh, these events made headlines on the front pages of American and Pakistani newspapers. And in this study, I intend to identify frames which were used by two leading English language newspapers in America and Pakistan to report on events that led up to the capture of Kabul by the Taliban in August 2021. So, these events that led to the capture of Kabul by the Taliban on August 16th were reported by both the American and Pakistani press with very different frames, which reflected the foreign policy of the respective countries uh, in regards to Afghanistan. And these observations correspond to uh, a study by Bennett where he notes that the nature of international news coverage by news media outlets is often consistent with foreign policy, and framing is an ongoing process occurring within a social cultural environment. So, therefore, it's natural that the US based media outlets would emphasize frames differently as compared to outlets from other countries like Pakistan. So a bit about the background of the Afghanistan conflict. The United States launched the war in Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks, and this conflict has lasted over 2 decades and spanned four presidencies. And the war only ended when the Taliban regained power 2 weeks before the United States was set to withdraw uh, all its troops from the region in August of 2021. And overall, this conflict resulted in the deaths of tens and thousands of people, and it cost the U.S. Above $2 trillion. And President Biden, in his speech, which he delivered on August 8th, 2021, he basically blamed the Afghan security forces for not holding up and for not fighting against the Taliban. And he blamed the Afghan president for fleeing and for being a coward. And basically, that's how the U.S. saw those events unfold. And locally, domestically, the U.S. American reaction, it drew comparisons to the capture of Saigon by the North Vietnamese forces in 1975. And this hasty withdrawal by the U.S. from Afghanistan was seen by the American press as a blow to the American global image and prestige. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan shares a border with Afghanistan, and its relations have been strained with Afghanistan since America toppled the Taliban back in 2001, and after that, the U.S. installed a new government, which was headed by Hamid Karzai. And unlike the Taliban, this new US backed government in Afghanistan was perceived to be hostile towards Pakistan. Pakistan and Afghanistan really didn't get along after that. And that's because of their different security interests. The Afghan government had cozy, friendly relationships with India, which Pakistan did not like. And hence, from Pakistan's strategic lens, a Taliban victory was seen as a defeat for a pro India Afghan government. And Pakistan was actually one of the few governments that recognized the Taliban as a legitimate government when they were last in power. And Pakistan also played a vital role in facilitating the recent peace talks between the Taliban and the U.S. Um, these peace talks basically led the Taliban taking over Afghanistan again. There is a sense of triumph within Pakistan that its policy of hedging and supporting the Taliban has played off. And Pakistan's concern is that the failed peace process could spark out an all out civil war in Afghanistan and lead to a massive influx of refugees into Pakistan. So Pakistan has had its own interest in regards to the events that were unfolding in Afghanistan when the Taliban were quickly regaining control. So the above statements, both by the American and Pakistani governments, uh, you know, they reflect how both governments are heavily involved in the Afghanistan conflict for different strategic interests and for different economic and security reasons. And with these divergent perspectives on the conflict in Afghanistan, I expect that the choice of frames used by the news media to report on Afghanistan will also be different as well. So, framing is basically the process that involves a selection and a selective representation. The framing process involves selective representation, which influences how audience think about, interpret, and judge issues. And elaborating on the need and utility of news frames, Nisbet in 2009 explains how framing is an unavoidable reality of the communication process, especially as applied to public affairs and policy. And framing a policy problem or a issue in those certain dimensions of the complex issue with greater apparent relevance than they would have under an alternative frame. So media also uses frames to control understanding and attitudes by selectively displaying information and elevating some meaning over others. So, for this reason, journalists can appear to follow the guidelines of objective reporting while framing news in ways that may be misleading as well. So, my hypothesis and research question, coming to that. So, building on the extensive body of research on framing, I will attempt to shed light on the different frames used by the American and Pakistani press to report on the dramatic Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, especially the events that unfolded between the 13th and 16th of August. 16th of August is when the Taliban captured or entered Kabul. Um, and this leads me to my hypothesis and research question. So my hypothesis is that the press from Pakistan and America will use different frames to report on events in Afghanistan during the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021. And my research question is, what were the different frames that were used by the Pakistani and American news media to report on the events that led up to the capture of Kabul in 2021? Right. So, first of all, I had to identify the the typology of frames that I would be using for my research. So, like different researchers have suggested, have proposed different methodologies of categorizing and identifying news frames. What I have done is that I have used Nisbet's proposed frames. Nisbet in 2009 proposed 8 different types of frames that are used in science and climate change reporting. I actually used these 8 different frames, and I appropriated them for my research, for my research on news frames from Afghanistan, because I thought these news frames were relevant and could be used in my research. So these were the news frames that Nisbet used in his study. On the left, you could see He proposed these 8 news frames, and he used the social progress frame, the economic and development frame, morality and ethics, science and technical uncertainty, Pandora box, Frankenstein monster, public accountability and governance, middle way, alternative path, conflict, and strategy. So what I've done is I've basically sort of used these frames, except for the scientific and technical uncertainty frame, which did not apply to my research. And for the purpose of my paper, I will be modifying the topologies that were presented in the previous table, and I will be using these frame topologies to categorize and define news frames from Afghanistan. So in the next table, what I've done is I have listed the frames from the topologies of frame, and these are the typologies of frames that I've used on the left column, and on the right side I've actually defined these frames. So to give you an example, the social progress frame would define would reflect how Taliban takeover means that life in Afghanistan will improve, the quality of life would improve for the Afghan people, or the Taliban takeover would solve Afghanistan's problems. And alternatively, this news frame can also be used to be to be this news frame can also be regressive. It can also highlight that the situation in Afghanistan is getting worse in terms of social progress, and Taliban takeover would actually be negative and regressive for the Afghan social progress, for Afghanistan's society. And so these are the news frames that I will be using. So after determining and defining the types of frames applicable to the Afghanistan conflict, I chose 2 leading independent newspapers from America and Pakistan, and I selected their front page news coverage of Afghanistan between the 13th and 16th of August. And these 2 newspapers are the New York Times from America and Dawn newspaper from Pakistan. Both of these papers are English language newspapers, and they have the largest circulation within their respective countries. So I selected the printed editions of both of these papers on the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th of August 2021. And what I've done is front page headlines related to Afghanistan from both newspapers were selected and categorized according to the date that they were published, and each headline was textually analyzed and interpreted and assigned a frame that best represented that headline. So just to give you an example, on the left is New York Times, and the headlines read Taliban capture Kabul, stunning US as a 20-year effort unravels in days. So the wording on the left, and compare that to the wording on the right from Dawn, Taliban enter Kabul, Ghani flees. Right? So what I've done is I have listed these headlines in the column, front page headlines from Afghanistan for both Dawn newspaper and New York Times, starting from the 13th, 14th, 15th, and ending on the 16th of August. So headlines from each of these newspapers for each of these dates have been extracted and listed here. And just to run you through, um, if we look at the Dawn headline on 13th of August, it says that Pakistan to help Taliban Turkey talks over Kabul airport, and Prime Minister Imran Khan said that on Thursday Pakistan would influence the Taliban for holding direct talks with Turkey to secure Kabul International Airport after U.S. troops completely exit the conflict hit Afghanistan by August 31st. So this I have um, I have chosen the alternative path or middle way frame. So this represents the alternative path or middle way frame, and the New York Times, in contrast, chose the Frankenstein monster Pandora box or policy gone wrong frame to report on events on the same date. So the New York Times headlines read for the same date, 13th of August, is US sends troops to aid of evacuation as Taliban surge. Two major cities brink over at the brink of takeover and bracing for Afghan government fall. So this is like a very alarmist headline, and as you could see, it's quite contrasting. It has quite a contrast, and this goes on for the rest of the headlines for the next 4 days as well. Uh, but I'm Okay, I'm gonna read two other headlines just to give you an idea because I'm not gonna go over all of them, but just to let you know, just to give you an idea of how I went about this. So the New York Times on the 14th of August um, reported um, in its headlines that over 15 cities slip out of grasp of Afghan forces. America's credibility sustains blow, quick collapse after US spends billions. So here in this headline, you could see the Pandora box frame or the Frankenstein monster frame and policy gone wrong. You could see the economic development loss frame where the headline has mentioned that the US had spent billions of dollars and that has gone down the drain. And the public accountability frame uh, is also used here because in the headline it says America's credibility sustains a blow. So somebody's responsible for that, right? So this on the same date, the Dawn newspaper reported from rather two different frames, which were a completely different choice. They had a conflict and strategy frame for their headlines and a social progress frame. So the headlines on Dawn newspaper read like this: Taliban set sight on Kabul after blitz through south after seizing four provincial capitals in a lightning offensive that took them closer to Kabul. The Taliban completed their sweep of Afghanistan on Friday, in the process also taking into custody a well-known warlord. UN urges neighboring countries to keep borders open. So, like, uh, what they've done is basically, in these headlines, they indicate that, oh, Taliban captured a warlord, and hence putting that into the headline indicates that, oh, it's somehow like, that's actually a good thing. Like Afghanistan was lawless, and there are warlords, and the Taliban took custody of a warlord, and putting that into a headline reflects the different frame. It's like a social progress frame that has been used here, and the conflict and strategy frame has also been used here, as if like, oh, it's just a conflict, and there are two or three different factions, and they're all fighting for power. So just a usual conflict and strategy device. Here, what I've done is in table 3, I have compiled all the news frames and the number of times those news frames were used in each newspaper between the 13th and 16th of August. So the social progress news frame was used once by Dawn, and the New York Times used it 0 times. The economic frame was used once by New York Times, and it wasn't used by Dawn. Morality frame was used by Dawn once. The New York Times didn't use that frame. Pandora box, Frankenstein monster, 4 times by the New York Times, and 0 times by Dawn. The conflict and strategy news frame was used thrice by Dawn, 0 times by New York Times, and middle way alternative path was used 3 times. And it was used 3 times by Dawn and 0 times by New York Times. They did not use this frame. And public accountability and governance frame was used 3 times by New York Times and 0 times by Dawn. So, in that table, you can see a stark contrast that can be observed in the usage of frames in the headlines of these two newspapers. And it's interesting to see that the Pandora box Frankenstein monster frame was used in the New York Times headlines 4 times, and Dawn, as I explained, did not even use the Pandora box Frankenstein monster frame even once. The morality frame was used by Dawn once, which alluded to the Taliban, that the Taliban was liberating Afghanistan from warlords. The economic frame was used once by New York Times to indicate that with the Taliban rise back to power, the tremendous amount of US investment in Afghanistan was lost and in vain. So basically, the Dawn News headlines reflected the events in Afghanistan as somewhat positive and acceptable, whereas the corresponding to the whereas the news frames from New York Times sounded alarmist, negative, and disturbing, and this was in congruence in this basically reflected the official stance of the American government as well. So the frames used by Dawn reflect the policy agenda of Pakistan government in regards to Afghanistan, and similarly, the frames used by New York Times also reflect the policy agenda of the American government. Uh, so the choice of frames corresponded to the public policy, foreign policy agenda of the respective governments, and so this study reconfirms that the journalistic reporting has the potential to promote political responses to foreign events through selective emphasis on certain issues, as we have seen, and framing is an ongoing process occurring within a social cultural environment. Therefore, it is natural that US based media outlets would emphasize frames differently than outlets in Afghanistan and nearby countries. So this study basically reconfirms how the use of frames to report events is related to news agenda, which in turn is influenced by government policy and agenda. This study also contributes to the study of framing by demonstrating how and why the press of two different countries report on the same international events with different frames. And I hope this study could be used to shed light on the many influences on independent media that affect objective reporting of international events. These are my references, and thank you for your attention.